How do you upload a file to S3 in a Java Spring Boot based application? In this video, let's dive on in and we will get to see how that works out. Okay, first things first. So I have a pom.xml. So this is a Maven project. This is currently running Java version 20. However, the code in here should be back portable all the way back to probably somewhere around Java 11, give or take. You might even be able to run this on Java 8. I'm not 100% sure about the dependency version of Spring Boot and Amazon's, the AWS SDK. So first things first, you're going to need to have the dependencies in place. So in your dependency management section for your Spring Boot application, you're going to need to add in the AWS dependency management repository here. So that is how you look that up. And then, of course, you're going to need the AWS Java SDK for S3. That's the resource that we're going to be interacting with. Next up, okay, so what does this whole application look like? Well, we're going to have a simple index page. So this is a proof of concept here, and it takes a form that will submit multi-part files, and we are going to accept audio files up there. It will be posting to the index endpoint, so feel free to adjust that as you need to. And then let's dive right on in. Okay, so I've got a configuration properties class right here that takes a handful of arguments. The endpoint URL, so this is the Amazon S3 API endpoint that you're going to be interacting with. A bucket name, your access key, your secret key, and then the region that all of this is in. I have some getters and setters in here. And if you prefer to use Lombok, then go ahead and wrap that with @data at the very top. Next up, we're going to need to create our Amazon client. So this is a service stereotyped class right here that takes in the Amazon S3. It bootstraps that inside of our initialize Amazon side of things. But in order to construct this class, our constructor requires the Amazon configuration class that we had previously pointed to. And then once we've got that set, we'll just point that to say this configuration equals the configuration that's injected in. And then we're calling initialized Amazon. So that's a private method right there. We plug in our credentials, and we're just using basic AWS credentials. You could modify this if you are running this Java application on an EC2 instance. But since a lot of people do local dev in, say, IntelliJ or whatever their preferred IDE is, then they might need to do that. We're going to use the Amazon S3 client builder, and we'll specify in the remaining arguments in here. So we specify the region, and then, of course, the AWS static credentials provider, which is being injected in with our credentials that we set up there. Now, I have a couple of getter methods in here just because that's kind of handy when you want to construct the URL that is returned out. And then we now have an index controller. So our index controller takes our Amazon client class. That's the one with the configuration and the built Amazon client SDK interface put together. We have a list of URLs. So these are the uploaded items that we've plugged in there. And these ones will be published at the bottom of our form when that's running. And then finally, we have our index controller constructor method. Again, like you could add in @required args annotation at the top of that if you want to inject in the Amazon client directly anywhere where you declare final on a property in your class. Okay, so let's go further down. So our get method right here. So we have request mapping. So this is taking /. So if you're to go to localhost :8080/ the index page, and we have the get mapping right here with nothing in here. These get smushed together, and that becomes the constructed URL path that Spring listens to. We'll get those in, and we're going to add items. This is our list right here. And then we have our DTO, so that's a data transfer object, which is our audio form. Let's dive into that real quick right after we explain that we return the index. Now, returning index is something that Timeleaf handles, and that's this form right here that we looked at a little bit previously. So we got that returning of the index. So we got the index controller, and now let's take a look at our audio form here. And this just takes an argument, an array of multi-part file that we're calling files. Now, although our HTML interface doesn't support multiple files, our controller does. So we could certainly allow multiple file uploads as long as someone is adding into the name files array right here. So that's what that looks like there. Back to our index controller, everything happens within our post method where that processing is occurring. So I'm going to make this a little bit wider so you viewers can actually see all of the source code in its glory. And we are going to be checking for errors. Now, you don't need to do this. This is just a handy dandy thing. If you have a larger form that's more complex, maybe you have a file upload with some fields that need to be validated, you can use the Hibernate validator and make sure that the method is in fact validated. And then we have a binding result here. This takes the inputs coupled with any errors, and that exposes that back to the visual interface. So Timeleaf can then process the errors on there. And then we can add our errors. So if we have any errors, then we're going to add those in our errors attribute here. Not totally necessary, but if you want that, you can do that there. Then we take our list of files, and if you'll typically want to have some kind of verification process on your files that you upload. So if you have images, for example, you might want to read those in using image.io. In this case here, I'm not actually doing any real validation other than making sure that the resource is in fact readable. Otherwise, we'd return, we're just returning true for any of this. But yeah, so any of that audio, it's happy, all that good. So if that returns true, then it's kind of a little bit funky. Like you'd expect return false means like it's not valid, but in this case here, true means it's valid. So we remove if that condition returns true. Let's see here. That's what that looks like. We have some, then we make our call to the AWS client code that we have, and we just say save image to S3. We don't need to do that, but I just called it save image because in another project I was working with images. So we can, let's see here, function shift F6 right here on a Mac, and we can save audio because that's what we're actually processing here. And this is the original image path. So we could just say, let's fix that as well. Okay, now I'll just do this way too, visually instead of using the keyboard. Shift F6. Okay, original path. So we can just do path right there. So that takes a string in there. And now we need to get the input stream. And I'm buffering this. Now you may run into some problems here because buffering is not always the most ideal thing, but we are converting that input stream into a byte array input stream, and then we're supplying that into the Amazon client. And then we publish that up, and then we are updating our permissions on there. So we are allowing these images to be read. And that is what that looks like here. Then we finally do the put object with the whole assembled request to Amazon. And with that, that is how you upload files to S3 using Spring Boot. If you want to follow this project along, I have the open source version of it right here. Upload file to S3 using Spring Boot. You'll want to download that, and of course then you'll need to modify the source main resources. I have an example, application.yml. I've got this bucket name here. Yours will be different. The region will be different, endpoint URL, and then you'll want to look at your access key and secret key. That comes from your home directory /.aws/credentials. And if you don't have AWS CLI set up locally, you'll want to get those from the AWS IAM management profile section of the AWS console. You'll sign in there, go to IAM, go to your users, find the user in question that you want to use for this, go to security credentials, and generate a key pair if you don't already have those for AWS API access. And that is how you upload files in Java with Spring Boot to Amazon S3.